Hello, and welcome to Justice Speaks. I am David Wallace, the Chief Assistant Prosecutor in Michigan in the United States, and the President of the Justice Speakers Institute. We are continuing with our approach of interviewing traffic safety leaders to get their perspective on current issues about traffic safety and what steps we can all take to save lives and make our communities and this world a safer place. With that, I'm ecstatic to introduce my guest today with Darrin Grondel, who is the Senior Vice President of Traffic Safety for the Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility, or FAR, and Brian Swift, the spokesperson for the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving, or NASID. Thank you both for joining me on Justice Speaks.
Thanks for having us, David.
Darrin, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm the Senior Vice President for the Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility, and also serve as the Director of the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving. And I get to work closely with my brother, Brian Swift, and it's been a great opportunity. I've been here for the last 3 years. Prior to that, I was with the Washington State Patrol for 25 and a half years and retired as a captain in 2017. But during that time, I was appointed by the governor, like the last 5 years of my career with the patrol, as the Highway Safety Office Director working for the Washington Traffic Safety Commission. So these issues around traffic safety, impaired driving, especially around the issues around legalization and the impacts on impaired driving, are very dear to my heart. So it's just a little bit of my background. So just glad to be here on the show with you.
Thank you. And I know that many years back when you were doing the Highway Safety Office there, I was hearing about some of the great things that you were doing in Washington. So it's truly an honor to have you here. Brian, how about you?
Well, I'm actually a Yooper. I'm from Escanaba. I grew up in Escanaba, was raised there. My undergrad, I went to Michigan State University, and then I actually got a master's from Northern Michigan University. So I spent pretty much my career in politics. I worked for a congressman from Michigan, Upper Michigan, by the name of Bob Davis for a long time. And then I worked for the governor, John Engler, for about 10 years. So really my background is politics. Currently, I've been for the last 13 years, I've been in Fort Worth, Texas, and I work for physicians. So I do public relations and communications and things like that.
Okay. Well, and for those that don't know, and obviously you and I know exactly what a Yooper is, someone from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I'm in the Lower Peninsula, so I know many times they called me a troll then from up there. So I'm under the bridge.
Right, exactly. I have a lot of friends that live in Traverse and Petoskey and Charlevoix, and they kind of think that's part of Northern Michigan, but we always remind them that they're below the bridge still.
Yep. So, Brian, it's great to have you here as well. Thank you for joining us. Now, Darrin, you mentioned that you're at FAR. What is FAR?
So the Foundation for Advancing Alcohol Responsibility was founded over 30 years ago by some of the leading distillers in the U.S. to address three main areas, and that is to eliminate underage drinking, responsibility for those who do choose to consume over the age of 21, and then focus for me is eliminating drunk driving and all other forms of impaired driving as we work with a number of partners to do that. So we have an educational department, we have a traffic safety department, we have a comms section. We do a lot of outreach on education and messaging around, like April, as we just finished up, was Alcohol Awareness or Responsibility Month. They used to call it awareness, but we've called it Responsibility Month. And so a lot of messaging, education, research around those issues, and how do we help to keep alcohol out of the hands of those that shouldn't have it, and then also for those that do choose to consume, that we keep them off the roadway after they've consumed. So a lot of work that we've done around responsibility.org, and you can see us at responsibility.org for a lot of the particular information. And there's a lot of good resources there for parents to have those conversations at a young age on, consuming, as far as consumption of alcohol, the impacts on the developing brain and those kind of things. We have a program called Ask, Listen, and Learn, and that is really designed for kind of the 9 to 13-year-old age group and how to address that. And then in 2021, we actually added a component addressing cannabis and how parents can have those conversations with their kids about cannabis and the impacts, especially on the developing brain in kids, is that kind of thing. So a lot of work that we've done. And in my work, if you go to r.org, or I'm sorry, responsibility.org, there's a whole section there on end drunk driving, and a tremendous amount of resources that are there to address that, from the whole DOI system, from kind of the education, prevention, all the way through the courts, treatment, and then adjudication and some of that rehabilitation piece.
Well, and as you know, I used to be in DC there at the National Center for DWI Courts, and responsibility.org has been a national leader in this effort to end impaired driving. So it's been doing great work. I absolutely encourage the listeners to go check it out, because there's a lot of wealth of information there on the website. So absolutely great stuff there.
Yes, thank you.
And as I understand it, Darrin, FAR has established NASID. What's the need and why was that done?
Well, really, this is Brian Swift's story and kind of the struggles and challenges that his family's been through. And I'll let him tell the story in a minute. But we began working with Brian and the state of Michigan on an oral fluid pilot project back in 2016. And that went from 5 counties. The next year went to all counties, and the success of what we saw from that. And then building on there was a small coalition that was working together to help bring that about. And we thought, how do we take kind of this momentum and energy and leadership and take it on a national scale? And so we said, look, responsibility.org, we could establish this group and help set it up. And then from there, Brian's been our spokesperson, and being able to really address the biggest challenge I think we face on our roadways today is multi-substance impaired driving.
Yes.
And so we saw that as an opportunity. Alcohol will always be our #1 priority, and focusing on drunk driving. But we also, as an organization, see that there's another component to this, is the multi-substance element. When I was in Washington State, alcohol, cannabis were our #1 combinations in fatal crashes. So I think there's a lot of awareness, education. Granted, is there additional research that needs to be done? Yes. But we help stand this up in support with Brian and support of his family, because no family should have to sit at the Thanksgiving dinner table or any holiday or any event without family members that have been killed because of an impaired driver. So
obviously, there's no question on that. Before I go to Brian, let me ask a quick question there.
Yeah.
You mentioned about an oral fluid test. What's it testing for?
What it does is it tests for about 6 or 7 different substances that are active, not something that's like a metabolite in that sense. It's really looking for an active substance in what they call an immunoassay. And it's just a collection of the saliva in the mouth, or the oral fluid within the mouth. And then it's actually puts into kind of a buffer, and then it actually determines, it's a little bit like our COVID tests, positive and negative. It doesn't give you an actual quantification, like a number. It just says that there's cannabis on board, or maybe like a heroin or a methamphetamine or a benzodiazepine or something like that. So, or marijuana or cannabis. And so those tests have been designed specifically to look for active substances that are within the oral fluid, which is really a diffusion from blood and those other things. So we can see what kind of chemicals are in the oral fluid. And those devices.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Jose, and this is to try to give law enforcement officers a quick and easy tool to, at least on the street there, when they stop someone, okay, let's find out right now if we can, and before we go any further. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, there's the kind of that 3-phase where you have the vehicle that's in motion, and you see, and you're developing probable cause for a traffic stop. Then you make that personal observation as you're in that contact with the driver, either odors or observations, responses from the driver, those kinds of things. So you're building to say, there's something wrong here. And then you have have them come out, do the standard field sobriety tests.
Yep.
And after that, is when officers would employ or could employ those very, very similar in many jurisdictions to a portable breath test or a preliminary breath test, some states would call them. And then they can employ that to see, maybe confirm or dispel some of their suspicions. But like I said, it's only like the top 6 or 7 that you would see in like DUI arrests or in fatal crashes. So just because you don't see it in an oral fluid doesn't mean that there's not other drugs that are on board. So, but the oral fluid is a nice screening tool. It is not an evidentiary tool. It is a screening tool to then make those to help you in that determination. Then do I need to get blood for this case? Because now I can smell alcohol, or I don't smell any alcohol at all. I got like a portable breath test or a preliminary with 000s, but yet this person is really impaired.
Right.
So just another tool that the officers, I think, would be a valuable tool to aid in that piece. When I was a trooper on the road, I would love to have had, those kinds of devices just in that process of the impaired driving investigation.
You bet. So Brian, as Darrin mentioned, you're the spokesperson for NASID, and he indicated you obviously have a very powerful story. And I don't know how much you want to tell. It's obviously up to you as always. But I'd be happy to have our listeners hear a little bit more about your background in that regard, and then how you came to NASID and how this came about.
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me. I'm like that person, like all of us, right, that gets that phone call that you never want to get. And person was on the end of the line. He said, your dad is dead, and you're rushing my mom to Marquette General Hospital from Escanaba. And my mom, it would turn out that the person who ran through a stop sign while smoking marijuana on a suspended driver's license, sideswiped my mom and dad. My dad died instantly, and then my mom ended up dying 3 days later. And of course, the devastation that creates in a family is unspeakable. So usually what victims have to go through is, first of all, they're trying to digest the loss of a loved one. Then what immediately follows is they have to go right into court, right? And that is a huge process in its own. It's very maddening. And if we're talking Michigan specific, you're talking about truth in sentencing laws, you're talking about plea bargains, you're talking about all these things that the common person doesn't know anything about. Right. And we were determined to fight to get a trial. And that took a lot of convincing. But the person who ended up eventually getting convicted was convicted of 3, 5 to 15-year felonies, one each for my mom and dad. So total 6, right? And that person ended up serving 4.5 years. So that is typical, right, of the story of victims, even if they're willing to put up a fight. Right. So because, as I mentioned, my background is in politics, and my mom and dad were 72 going on 50, right? They were just starting to live life. And I had to do something to make their life and not let this, their story die in vain. And so I turned to my political friends. And one of those people I first turned to was Tom Casperson, who was a state senator in Upper Michigan. I said, Tom, what can we do? And believe me, as a victim, I think you want to take on just so many things, right? I wanted to take on laws. There were so many things. But we went to the state police and we said, what do you need? And the state police came back and they said, we need oral fluid testing in Michigan. And that led to the pilots that Darrin talked about, the 5 counties, then the 83 counties. It was the first law in the country. And that has since spurred states like Indiana and those to kind of make oral fluid testing, right, a normal part of, because we have this multi-substance impairment going on all over this country, we need to have, right, other tools in the toolbox. And that is what oral fluid is all about. Now, unfortunately, Michigan, and I hate to say this because I'm from Michigan, We have fallen backwards. We have dropped the ball. I am trying to make our law permanent in Michigan.
Sure.
And we need to make sure as more and more states legalize. And for me, this is not about marijuana. It's not about legalization. This is about a person choosing to make a really horrible decision that affects other people's lives. And so whether it's cocaine, whether it's prescription drugs, whether it's marijuana, I don't care. We just do not want you out on the roads driving. And that's what this whole effort, that is what NASID is about. That is what we're putting our time and effort in. And so we have to, the process is slow, but as Darrin mentioned, we have some, I think the feds are recognizing we have this multi-substance abuse problem. We need more testing. We need more toxicology. We know that people are out there. They shouldn't be on the roads and they're killing people.
Well, Darrin, let me come to you as far as one of the things there that Brian mentioned, and I think we want to come back to, is just how it used to be impaired driving focused on alcohol. And that's not the case anymore nowadays, is it? It's evolved, and not in a good way, but it's evolved and changed. So now it's so much broader than that, and it's not just illegal drugs; it's legal drugs, whether it's marijuana or other prescribed medications. It seems like we're seeing this huge dichotomy of change now that's making it harder for the things. So it's like what we got right now with what happened to Brian's family.
You know, we did a research study with the Governor's Highway Safety Association a few years ago, looking at drunk driving and drug driving and what kind of the perceptions of that were. And, you know, we know a lot about alcohol. It's a very simple molecule. It's water soluble, the whole thing. And the perceptions from the people that we had, the respondents, were that drunk driving is socially unacceptable. But you see the numbers and you're like, really? It really needs to be socially unacceptable, but the numbers are still high. But that was the responses. Now, when it came to what are your understandings of drug driving, you know, there's a ton of drugs. How do they interact with the body? How, you know, I'm not this falling down drunk. I'm not sloppy, and, you know, I may be dizzy or I might be just a little bit lightheaded. People may not think that's impairment, but that's truly impairment. Yeah. And so depth perception, reaction times, those kind of things. And so in that part of it, under drugged driving, one of the revealing things with that was that there was no real kind of, it was almost a social apathy on it. They're like, well, I'm not really sure about drug driving. And so it kind of comes back to, you know, we have done a tremendous job on education and messaging what is drunk driving. But have we incorporated that into our kind of our vernacular in just our regular messaging on TV, radio, or in the newspaper, social media, those kind of things of there is another element here called drugged driving. And it's not just about illicit substances, it's about any substance. It could be Benadryl, it could be like an over-the-counter, it could be a prescription medication. And then you start thinking about those substances that mix and match, you know, where it says do not drink alcohol while on this medication. Well, there's a reason, is that those begin to amplify those impairment. Some might say synergistic or amplification or multiplying, you know, those impacts. And so that's really difficult to then measure just off of a blood test to say, oh, you're equivalent to a 0.14 or a 0.15 DUI. However, the officer who's trained in the standard field sobriety tests can clearly articulate, look, this is what I observed, this is what I saw, this is the responses and my observations, and clearly can say this person's impaired. And so when they themselves might think, I don't feel impaired.
Right.
And so because they've equated, I think, in their own mind that I'm not, got that slurred speech, and they're not that sloppy down drunk. That's, I think, an image that needs to be changed to these are elements of impairment. I was at the group a while ago and they're like, wow, I don't know if I would have thought about that being impairment. And so these become jurors, and these become, the public themselves needs to understand for their own limitations, especially if they're serving at a party or they have friends or whatever. Don't let them drive when that they're impaired. And there's an interesting, I think, an element here for like with alcohol is that you'll ask people at kind of a lower level alcohol if they would drive, like the 0.06, 7 or 8 or somewhere in that ballpark, and they may, no, I wouldn't drive. Then they have like the little higher and they're like, yeah, I think I would drive. It's almost like that invincibility phase, the Mellanby effect. And so that's another piece of helping to help understand between alcohol and drugs, or even in the mixing, because we're seeing so many toxicology reports come back with 5, 6, 7 different drugs in the body. Now, presence doesn't always equal impairment. And I want to make sure that that part's clear. But when you start seeing these mixing and matchings of drugs that are impairing in and of themselves, matching up, that's part of this ongoing challenge. And you are right. When we see 50% or almost 51% of fatal crashes where there's a known drug test result, that there's a high percentage that have one alcohol, but then cannabis or other substances that are on board. And I think that that's why this is so important. And Brian and his family have been through a gut-wrenching experience.
Yeah.
But I applaud him for really sticking with this and pushing, especially in Michigan, who could be a leader in this arena of getting these types of technologies out there to address. Because we hear all the time, well, there's no breathalyzer for cannabis. Well, there is an oral fluid test that can detect that. It doesn't detect impairment, and it's not intended to, because we don't have a number for impairment for cannabis.
Right.
It's really, are we seeing substances on board closer to the proximal time of driving than an hour or 2 hours later when we finally get a blood result? So that's part of this process, is getting these tools into the officer's hands to be able to have that kind of technology to make better decisions roadside.
I would just say, David, to add to that, we all see with our eyes, right, on TV every day in areas, right? We've got a problem in this country, right? We whether it's prescription drugs, you name whatever the substance is, we have a huge problem. And to think that these people are sitting at home, hanging out and not going on our roads is just ludicrous, right? So we have this technology that is available. Why in God's name will we not use that technology? And this is not junk science. This is not anything other than to keep people, detect them before they kill somebody, like my mom and dad. I can guarantee everybody listening to this podcast does not want to get that call. And a lot of people go, right, it can happen to me. I'm telling you, it can happen to you. And we can do better. Michigan needs to step up again. They were leading and to fall back. So we really need the governor. We need our legislators in Michigan. They've got an opportunity. They've been looked at as a leader, but I'm saying other states now are overtaking them, and we have got to get back to doing what's right. And oral fluid testing is proven. It's recognized. Look, we just had a big ruling, right? Whether it's the truckers, whether it's the airlines, whether it's the rail, they recognize this is a useful technology to get somebody off the road before they kill somebody.
Well, and Brian, you mentioned, and as I recall, I think it was 2019, was there a press conference there at the Capitol in Michigan about this oral fluid test, and
Yes,
and trying to get the law the next step there, as I recall. But you moved on in the sense, not I say moved on, but you expanded and to get to NASID and try to make this as a national effort. So,
right.
I know you have a number of members, partners that are working with you on that. Who are some of the organizations in that are trying to support this expansion, this important effort.
Right. Well, and I think Darrin can speak a little bit, but to give you an example, right, on this issue, multi-substance impairment, right? So we started out, like Darrin mentioned, this little band of brothers, and we now, right, have MAD on our team. We have Canopy, which are the, and Darrin can explain this a little bit better, but we are talking about the marijuana company, right, the biggest that recognize, okay, we now have got to, as responsible citizens, we have got to be a part, right, of this situation. You know, we have a number of partners, Drager, Abbott, which are state-of-the-art devices when it comes to oral fluids. And Darrin can name some other partners of ours, but we really have major players that recognize, again, this is a huge problem in our country. The other thing I'll mention is that we got to stop this old way of thinking of right, being reactive and not proactive.
Sure.
And that, again, I think goes a long way on what our organization is trying to do. If there's a better technology, we're going to be working with those companies to detect, whether it's stagmus, whatever it happens to be. We're in this phase where great technologies are coming online, and we want to be at the forefront of that and working, again, not to arrest the world, not to give tickets to everybody, but to prevent a tragedy, because you do not want to live with this. Nobody wants to live with this. It's for a lifetime. It's a lifetime sentence.
And what many people may not understand is we always talk about, as a prosecutor, I'm in the rural community in Huron County, which is in the thumb of Michigan. Small rural community, not as small as where you were up in the UP, but obviously these kind of crashes that happen especially with someone, that's one of the biggest cases that prosecutor's office will handle typically in a year.
Yes.
It's not something like, you know, you always think about, well, there's all these murders. No, this is our death case. This is our murder case in these rural communities. And having these tools can help make a difference in at least hopefully stopping it before it gets that too far.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, it just seems we kind of have this laissez-faire attitude about this issue, whether it's drunk driving, whatever, whether it's drug driving. It's like, right, how many convictions, how many, right, the recidivism. And it's kind of a theme, right? The people that continue to commit the same sorts of offenses. It's like, look, I'm for giving everybody a second chance. I think everybody deserves that. But we're talking about life and death issues. And when you start seeing people, right, that are getting all these sorts of offenses, and then finally they kill somebody, you know, that's why, again, we're involved with the drug courts. We're involved. We have an organization that is all encompassing. We care about people that are having issues like substance abuse issues and things like that. We have a heart for people. So this is not all about law enforcement or new gadgets to you know, try to pull people over. We're looking at the whole situation. And I think that's, again, where NASID stands out. And that's why other organizations like MAD, and Darrin can talk about a few of the others, why they're on our team.
Darrin, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit more about NASID and who's involved and what's some of the things you're hoping to achieve here in the next year or so?
So we have a number of companies like Abbott, we had Drager, Intoxilock, Smart Start. Those are a couple of ignition interlock companies, but they do see the value and the importance of the work that we're engaged in. We've got SAD, we have Uber. So they understand too the importance of, you know, ride shares that people are going to be consuming, or holidays, you know, they want to be a part of that. The AAA Foundation is part of NASID. Governor's Highway Safety Association, the National Safety Council. We have 3 tiers of members, which we have advocates, advisors, and then allies. And they recognize that because we're kind of a 501c4, so we can lobby.
Okay.
And so we try to do some of that lobbying work and legislation and federal, state pieces. And so, but there are some groups like the National Sheriff's Association, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, the Institute of Technology and Management and Safety Research, or I'm sorry, Traffic Safety Management Research. It's ITSMR from the University of Albany in New York. And there's like also the National District Attorneys Association, the Recording Artists Against Destructive or Drunk Driving. Some of those groups are not allowed to lobby. So they are part of us, but when it comes to the lobbying efforts, we shield them from that. And so, but it's groups and partners that are a part of that. There's another group called We Save Lives, who was founded by Candace Leitner, who founded MAD. MAD Canada is a part of us because they can see the importance of the hands across the border piece of this, because it's legalized in all provinces in Canada. But, and there's that transitory population that's coming across the border too. They understand the importance of these issues. And so there's probably another couple that and one that was really interesting is the Carrie Ann DeMott Foundation out of Florida. Bill DeMott, who was a WWF wrestler who lost his daughter, joined us in this fight as well. And so, and I think his daughter was killed by a repeat offender, multiple substance. So just to kind of name off a few of the groups that are a part of this, because they see the importance. We are looking for additional corporate sponsors as well to help us, because a lot of the things we want to do are, how do we get good education and messaging out there on these issues, especially with legalization. When I was in Washington, over and over, I heard, well, cannabis is not a big deal. And, you know, it doesn't lead to crashes. I'm a better driver. I slow down. I'm not as aggressive. And what we've seen is that that's not true. And so it is an intoxicant.
But it's not true. It's based on research that it's not true.
Correct. And so it's, you know, a lot of it was anecdotal. Now that over the years, we've seen that it's, you know, in Washington State, fatal crashes went up. Colorado, fatal crashes went up where it's cannabis involved, or cannabis only. And so, and this is not an indictment on cannabis. This is an indictment on drug driving, period. You know, we don't take a position on the legalization, but we do take a position on the impaired driving piece of it. You know, people want to consume, that's their right, but don't bring that onto the roadway. Don't be consuming while you're driving. And so, in understanding that. So NASID really wants to do a lot of work around the educational piece. How do we help train law enforcement officers in the identification and detection of this? How do we get toxicologists, or at least evidence for those things, like with evidential blood draws for law enforcement phlebotomy programs, toxicology for prosecutors, and then screening and assessments. As Brian said so eloquently, we're not out to hammer the world. What we want is people, one, to make the right decision. But when they don't, that there's accountabilities built into that process, and that we can provide to a prosecutor, to a judge. Clearly, you know, oftentimes we have alcohol, we may get a blood alcohol level, and then we stop testing. And we do a real disservice to the individual as well to the public, because alcohol may just be a masking agent where they have a controlled substance problem, and yet we don't even address that. So that's where NASID is wanting to go, is how do we address kind of that whole person? And is punishment just, you know, the solver of all of this? And it's not. It's about screening them. Do they have mental health disorders and maybe a co-occurring substance abuse disorder, or vice versa? And so how do we help the courts understand what that is so that they can provide the proper interventions in that regard? Then, so through the probation and the follow-ups and those kind of things, are there accountabilities in place that help these people to get off that spin cycle of constant drug abuse, those kind of things? And so that's where I think NASID is all about punishment and punitive. It's about how do we get this person so we see them recidivate, and we don't see them continuing to make the same bad decision. So that's a little bit about kind of the NASID element, providing resources, education, publications. You know, I do a ton of presentations around the country. I just was sharing, I was literally coast to coast this last month, and because this stuff matters, people matter, and it isn't about, oh yeah, it's not that big of a deal. Well, it is a big deal, and I think oftentimes we minimize it in maybe the state laws, or minimize it within some of the processes that we have in place, because this is pretty significant.
The train has left the station, right?
Yeah.
And so what happens, right? These states put the cart before the horse, right? And we want them to understand, okay, great. In the case of, again, marijuana, I'm not picking on them. I mean, obviously the person that killed my mom and dad was solely smoking marijuana, but I want to take this larger view, which I think is the right view. And we want to show these states, okay, if you're going to legalize, usually they'll legalize, and then they won't have a plan in place. And right, so what kind of legislation, what kind of tools do you need? That again is where we can help with model legislation, those sorts of things. And here again, I hate to keep bringing up Michigan, but we need to get back. We were a leader. We need to start leading again in Michigan. And so anybody out there, my fellow, Michigan friends, let's get back on track. And, we talk about lobbying. I testify, I'm willing to go anywhere, any place, anytime for victims, to help hold their hands. There are a lot of people that they don't, right? They're grieving. They don't know the political, they know they want to do something, but they don't know how to navigate this big political world. I just happen to be in politics. I happen to have great friends that said, Brian, we want to help you. But, we want to be able to help those people because, again, it's the people that are left behind in this day and age, I think, that continue to just go, what is wrong? Why is nobody listening to us? Why is nobody, it might be a one-day story, a one-week story, but this is a lifetime sentence to victims. Yeah. And that is why, again, NASID, we're there on the front lines. We want to be there for people in communities to show them we can solve this problem.
Brian, let me follow that up. If someone wants to learn more about NASID or what they can do and get involved, where do they go?
Yeah, so obviously I'm happy to talk with anybody.
I would just say, David, if anybody wants to learn more about NASID, and obviously if they wanted to become a member of NASID, is to go to NASID or NASID.org. Yeah. And we are part of responsibility.org. All the members that I listed off are really part of a coalition, really working to address and help states prioritize multi-substance impaired driving. So
to wrap this up, I want to come back. Brian, you mentioned in our previous, before we started the podcast episode, that there was some big news about oral fluid testing nationally. Do you want to share that with our audience?
Yeah, I think Darrin would be better able to address that because we'd have breaking news here the last couple of days, and Darrin would be better to explain how all that worked.
So the United States Department of Transportation, or USDOT, had been working on a final rule to incorporate oral fluid as part of that testing procedure for those that are under federal regulation, like the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for commercial vehicle operators, for Federal Aviation Administration, and then the Federal Railroad. And so I think for that, it's really, they've gone quite a bit of extensive research and science and exploring this, because that's a really key piece, I think, is almost kind of a validation in many respects that this is not pseudoscience. This is not just something that they threw together. But, we've been very used to doing COVID tests with saliva testing for a couple of years now. And this is no different, but we're looking for those active substances that could be impairing, like Delta-9 THC or the 11-hydroxy. So we're seeing that actually testing positive for cannabis. And so that is, I think, a great change that came out yesterday in Politico. So if any, I wish I had the link for you right here, right off my top of my mouth, but I don't. But that is available, and it is part of the U.S. code that they're putting. That is, or it ties into the U.S. code, but it is now a final rule that can be utilized.
And to let everybody know and that's listening, I will also have a link in the show notes to NASID, as well as I'll make sure to have a link to this important rule that has come out now for at least for the commercial operators. And hopefully we can get that to expand even further than that.
So one thing I'd like to just share with your listeners is when we train officers in identifying a drunk driver, they do a wet lab where they have volunteers that come in and they actually dose them at different levels of alcohol. They have one that's a placebo, so they have alcohol in the breath, but they haven't consumed anything. And so they go through the testing procedure. And, standard field sobriety test, the observations, all those kind of things. The horizontal gaze, nystagmus, one-legged stand, the walk and turn, basic tests that they will do performing those. So now with cannabis, many years ago, we thought about how do you actually help train the officers into detecting some of this other type of impairment. And so that actually kind of formed into what they call a green lab, and kind of like our wet lab, but with volunteers that have actually consumed cannabis, usually medical marijuana patients or others that have volunteered. Now, states themselves are starting to conduct some of these types of trainings, like Maryland, Ohio, Washington State has done some, Missouri, Connecticut just did a significant study on this. But if anybody's interested, on our website at responsibility.org or NASID.org, you can see a publication called the Cannabis Impairment Detection Workshop Handbook. It's a mouthful, but it really gives states kind of a guide in how do they actually run a green lab in their state. And so we've been doing those. We just did 2 in Denver in April, and one was part of a drug recognition expert training. It was regional training, and the next one was for the group Canopy that Brian was mentioning, which is a organization that's actually out of Canada, but it works with the cannabis dispensaries or the co-ops. And so they came down because they are really looking at how do we really make that message of don't consume and drive, and part of that. So we were able to show them some of the issues around the impairment. Great relationship with the industry, because, like, again, this is not an indictment on them. It's, or any, of that legalization piece, but really it's about how do we get that message to the public, not to consume and drive. And what I'm hearing is NACE is working on education, as you mentioned, in the training for law enforcement. And Brian mentioned model laws as well. So you're trying to be all encompassing here to really make a comprehensive effort. If that's what I'm hearing at this point. That's right. Yeah. And one thing too is that we just released with the National District Attorneys Association, because we understand the challenges that drug driving creates in the courtroom. And so we've done a couple things with them. There's one is how to prosecute the drugged driver training. And that has 3 hours of CLE credit for those that are looking for bar licensure. I guess it's that annual relicensing. But we also just released a new document. I should say it's a renewed document from 2004 called Drug Toxicology for Prosecutors. And it walks through the whole process of that for a prosecutor, how to build foundation for a toxicologist. What does the toxicology report really mean? Those kinds of things. So it really helps guide that process, and that's available on our website, as well as the National District Attorneys Association's National Traffic Law Center's webpage as well. That's fantastic. Brian, yeah. That's something else you wanted to add there?
No, I would just say, I think, we have probably now 3 decades of people, right, that really don't understand that impairment, right, doesn't just necessarily mean alcohol. And so the education piece is really important. And so that will be a focus. And I think, again, don't want to beat a dead horse, but we have these technologies available today. And I know there's a lot of pushback sometimes from groups that'll say, well, you're targeting people, you're doing this or that or the other thing. And I want to say to those sorts of people is that, look, Somebody taking your loved one's life on the highway doesn't have anything to do with race, doesn't have anything to do with gender. All these societal things, I think, that we kind of beat up each other on each side of the aisle on. This is really and should be a nonpartisan issue that we can all get behind, because ultimately everybody cares, right, about their loved ones. And so, you know, we need to set politics aside on these sorts of public health issues that are going on, and certainly on our roads now. You add on, right, texting and you know, I mean, all the sorts of things. Highways are roads are a really dangerous place. And so we got to get back to paying attention, and we got to get it right. Are certainly that 18 crowd, under 18, the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds that, again, have this impression that Darrin mentioned, well, maybe I'm a better driver, right? If I'm only taking an edible or whatever it happens to be, all right, I'm on Adderall, whatever, right? And again, not an indictment on anything. It's more of an educational thing. But we got to turn the corner now. There's just too much carnage on our roads, and we have the tools and technology now to do it. So we're behind the curve. The United States is way behind other countries when it comes to this, and we got to get with the program. And that's why we say, come join us at NASID and learn more about what we're doing.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap this up, and powerful message there by Brian. Well, he has a powerful story, but just also, it's time to take action. Time to step up and to the plate, so to speak, and let's do it. And so I want to thank both of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to speak to everybody about NASID and FAR as well, and the work that's being done out there, because it's about changing lives and saving lives. And the work you're doing, I know, is making a difference and changing lives and hopefully, I believe, saving lives as well. So thank you so much for your time and working this whole effort.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, David.
The Justice Speaks podcast is brought to you by the Justice Speakers Institute, LLC, the premier international speakers bureau on justice issues. This podcast is to give you the knowledge and be able to ask the questions on creating justice in your community.